Beneath a clouded sky in the heart of Seoul, South Korea, the police station stood tall, a symbol of order amidst the city's relentless energy. The bustling streets around it carried the rhythm of a city that never paused, a constant flow of lives intertwined with moments both ordinary and extraordinary. Woo Jimchul, a detective in his 4th year with the Violent Crimes Investigation Unit, approached the station with measured steps. There was something heavy within him, a strange sense of loss that came and went like an uninvited guest in his thoughts. It wasn't tied to any memory he could recall, yet the emptiness it left felt unmistakably real. Each time he tried to delve into the feeling, hoping to uncover its source, he found nothing. The absence only grew, spreading like a quiet void in his heart. Inside the station, the usual hum of activity filled the air. A young rookie detective handed him a coffee, snapping him momentarily out of his reverie. Jimchul accepted it with a small nod of gratitude, letting the warmth of the cup settle in his hands. Though his thoughts still lingered on the strange void within him, Jimchul reminded himself of the life he led. There was no space for distractions or sorrow in his demanding career. The rhythm of his work left little room for introspection. As Jimchul entered the office, his gaze landed on 3 men seated side by side. Their presence immediately caught his attention, and he wondered what had brought them there. The rookie detective nearby seemed hesitant to explain, glancing nervously at the trio. One of the men, his voice trembling, began to mutter something barely audible. His words spilled out in fragments, but the core of his story was chilling. He described a shadow rising from the ground, speaking to him in an otherworldly manner. He claimed the shadow had given him a dire ultimatum: surrender within 24 hours or face a punishment so severe it would make him regret being alive. The other 2 men nodded frantically, their faces pale with fear. One of them, unable to contain his terror, begged to be imprisoned immediately, admitting to crimes he had likely been hiding. Jimchul listened quietly, taking a sip of his coffee as he pondered the bizarre accounts. He struggled to decide how he should even begin to report something so unusual. Before he could dwell further, a colleague interrupted his thoughts, summoning him to the meeting room. The rookie detective, eager to help, stepped forward and offered to handle the men in their reports. Jimchul handed over the responsibility and made his way to the conference room, his mind still processing the strange events. Inside the meeting room, the atmosphere was tense. The chief detective addressed the situation with an unusual request. They were to release those who had willingly surrendered. Jimchul's confusion and frustration boiled over momentarily, but the chief quickly silenced him, reminding him to keep his voice down to avoid alarming others outside. Jimchul Woo felt his frustration bubbling to the surface. The chief detective's proposal seemed absurd, almost reckless. They were seriously considering releasing the men who had come forward in fear, claiming to have seen a shadow monster just to see what would happen. The chief, calm but firm, explained the reasoning behind the decision. It wasn't just about releasing them, it was about observing the results if they remained outside for the full 24 hours as the mysterious shadow had warned. To Jimchul, the idea seemed ludicrous. He argued that the men were likely hallucinating, possibly under the influence of a new drug, and that their bizarre claims had no basis in reality. But his colleague quickly countered, pointing out that all the men had tested negative for drugs. The forensic reports were clear, and the results had been double-checked to avoid any doubts. Jimchul struggled to process the information. How could they explain such a detailed and identical experience shared by people who had no apparent connection to one another? The colleague reminded Jimchul of the broader situation. The higher-ups had been aware of these strange occurrences for a while now, yet no concrete explanations had surfaced. Allowing the scenario to play out might be the only way to uncover a clue, no matter how nonsensical it sounded. The chief added that their goal was simple: recreate the scenario described by the men and see if there was any truth to their claims. Jimchul, still uneasy, voiced his concern. What if something truly happened to these individuals? What if the threat they spoke of was real? At this, the room shifted. The detectives collectively turned to Jimchul, and their wide laughter filled the air. The chief, shaking his head with a grin, teased him, surprised to see such superstition from someone as pragmatic as Detective Woo. The comment stung slightly, but Jimchul forced a dry laugh to defuse the moment. The chief detective placed a reassuring hand on Woo Jimchul's shoulder, his voice calm but resolute. He explained the plan. The suspects would be taken to a quiet storage warehouse, guarded by several strong detectives. There would be no chance for them to escape. It was meant to be a controlled situation. The chief even joked lightly, suggesting that if a monster truly appeared as the suspects had claimed, it might actually provide answers they were seeking. He opened the floor for volunteers, but assured Jimchul that if he was uncomfortable with the idea, he could opt out. Jimchul hesitated for a moment. The entire situation felt surreal, but his sense of duty outweighed his doubts. Resolving to see it through, he agreed to join the operation. Outside the station, the suspects were taken to a warehouse under close surveillance. Detectives surrounded the area, ensuring no one could enter or leave without being noticed. notice. The men inside were visibly terrified, pleading for their lives. The detectives reassured them firmly, though not without a hint of impatience. The atmosphere was tense but controlled. As dawn approached, the chill in the air grew sharper, and even though it was spring, their breaths formed faint clouds in the cold. The detectives were growing bored. With little happening, some began to shift focus, chatting idly about the time remaining until the supposed 24-hour mark. But amidst the stillness, Woo Jimchul remained watchful. Something didn't sit right with him. A strange unease pressed on his mind, like the calm before a storm. It was just as they'd expected. Nothing had happened. The air was heavy with anticipation as the final seconds ticked away, marking the end of the 24-hour deadline set by the ominous shadow. The warehouse was still, save for the nervous breaths of those inside. The criminal, his face pale with fear, looked around in confusion. His trembling voice broke the silence, questioning why nothing had occurred. One of the detectives, exasperated, accused the men of fabricating the story, suggesting they had taken drugs together and were hiding the truth. The criminal, desperate, insisted that what they had seen was real, even mentioning there had been 4 of them initially. Before the tension could escalate further, Woo Jimchul, who had been standing alert at the side, felt a sudden and overwhelming dread. Instinct kicked in, and he shouted a desperate warning to his colleagues. But it was too late. From the ground, dark shadows began to swirl and expand, taking form before anyone could react. The overwhelming force knocked 2 detectives to the ground, leaving them unconscious. The criminal froze in place, his eyes wide with terror as tears streamed down his face. A guttural scream escaped his lips, but it was drowned out by the horrifying sight unfolding before him. Jimchul moved to rush toward the fallen men, but his feet stopped as if rooted to the ground. His eyes widened in disbelief as monstrous figures emerged from the shadows. They were creatures that vaguely resembled humans, but bore the unmistakable features of ants, their black carapaces gleaming under the dim light. There were 3 of them, and their movements were swift and predatory. Without hesitation, the monsters descended upon the criminal, tearing into him with brutal efficiency. Blood sprayed across the warehouse, and the man's agonized screams filled the air. The creatures ripped his limbs apart and devoured him piece by piece, their grotesque feast reducing him to a scattered mess of blood and flesh in moments. Jimchul stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the horrific scene before him. It felt as if his very spirit had abandoned his body, leaving him in a daze. The grotesque sight of the monsters devouring the criminal played on repeat in his mind, but the horror wasn't over. 2 of the ant-like creatures turned toward Jimchul, their eerie gazes locking onto him. His heart raced as he noticed something peculiar. For a moment, it felt as though the creatures were smiling at him, an unnatural, menacing smile that defied reason. It wasn't just their expression that unsettled him, it was the way they seemed pleased, almost glad to encounter him. His horror deepened as they began to sink back into the shadows. Jimchul's thoughts raced. The situation felt disturbingly familiar, though he couldn't explain why. A strange sense of deja vu washed over him, as if he had seen such horrors before. But how? His confusion and fear clouded his judgment as he remained rooted in place. The aftermath was chaos. The chief detective stormed into the scene later, furious after hearing about the incident. His voice boomed with anger as he demanded answers. The chief's rage was palpable. He berated the detectives for the disaster, pointing out that the suspects had disappeared entirely, and 2 officers had been found unconscious. None of the detectives had an explanation and remained silent under the weight of his fury. Turning to Jimchul, the chief demanded an account of what had happened. Jimchul hesitated before explaining that he had called for an ambulance after regaining consciousness, but beyond that, he couldn't recall much. The chief let out an exasperated laugh, shaking his head. Despite his anger, he seemed more concerned about keeping the matter under wraps. He declared that the incident hadn't been reported to the higher-ups yet and gave strict instructions to everyone involved. The chief ordered firmly that this case never happened. The injured officers got hurt while investigating the Gorogu gang. That's the story we're sticking to. The detectives nodded in agreement, their voices subdued as they responded with a unified acknowledgement. While sitting at his desk, Jimchul couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. His thoughts raced as he pieced together the strange events. The case of the criminals surrendering themselves nagged at his mind, refusing to let him rest. One of the detectives approached him, curious about his focus on the matter. Jimchul acknowledged that he wasn't officially pursuing the case, but he admitted to investigating it on his own. The detective seemed impressed by his dedication, but pointed out the curious fact that this phenomenon wasn't isolated. Similar incidents were occurring outside their jurisdiction. Jimchul studied the data on his monitor, his brow furrowing as he examined the patterns. The detective leaned in to look closer, noticing a strange trend. Between late February and early March, the number of criminals giving themselves up had dropped significantly. The observation made Jimchul pause. He asked if the detective had any thoughts about what could cause such a pattern. The detective laughed, brushing off the inquiry with a seemingly trivial memory. He mentioned his aunt, who used to run a small book rental store. Business always slowed down during the same period because children were returning to school after vacation. Jimchul listened carefully, his mind working through the connection. On the surface, the information seemed unrelated, even irrelevant, but something about it stuck with him. He nodded thoughtfully, deciding it might be worth keeping in mind. A day before the entrance ceremony at a high school for incoming freshmen, the principal held a private meeting with Mr. Park, the teacher in charge of student affairs. The atmosphere in the office was serious as the principal placed a document on the desk, pushing it toward Mr. Park. With curiosity, Mr. Park scanned the file, expecting something alarming. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The student's father worked at a fire station, the mother was a housewife, and the academic records were decent. Nothing hinted at trouble. The principal, however, urged him to look deeper, directing his attention to a specific detail in the file. It was then that Mr. Park noticed the note about the student leaving home for 2 years during the first grade of middle school. This single fact set the student apart from others and hinted at a history far more complex than the surface suggested. The principal explained the circumstances surrounding the student's transfer and voiced his concerns. He wanted to ensure the school was prepared to handle any potential challenges this new student might bring. Mr. Park, however, was undeterred. His eyes sparkled with confidence as he took in the situation. Known for his strict and unwavering approach to discipline, he had earned the nickname Viper among his peers. To him, this challenge was an opportunity to prove his skills. The high school freshmen assembled on the field for the entrance ceremony, their chatter filling the air as they took advantage of the relaxed teachers to reunite with friends from middle school. Among the sea of students, Mr. Park, with his sharp eyes, spotted the one student he had been briefed about, the so-called troublemaker, Sung Jinwoo. Gripping a stick in his hand, Mr. Park's lips curled into a confident grin. He approached Jinwoo with determined steps, his mind brimming with thoughts of discipline. This was a student he was determined to tame, no matter how chaotic his past might have been. With a loud and authoritative voice, Mr. Park confronted Jinwoo. His attention fell on a small detail, the gloves Jinwoo wore. He roared, demanding an explanation. Jinwoo, startled by the outburst, raised his head and met Mr. Park's eyes. At that moment, Mr. Park's world shifted. The noisy field, the carefree students, everything around him seemed to fade. What he saw instead was an overwhelming and terrifying sight. An army. It wasn't just any army, but a seemingly endless sea of shadow soldiers standing in perfect formation, stretching as far as the horizon. Their imposing presence sent chills down his spine. Snapping back to reality, Mr. Park shook his head, unsure if what he had witnessed was real or a trick of his imagination. Desperately trying to regain his composure, he barked orders at the other students to be quiet and stand properly. Inside, however, he was deeply unsettled, questioning whether his eyes had deceived him. From within Jinwoo's shadow, Bellion observed the scene with curiosity. He whispered quietly to his liege, noting that Mr. Park seemed to have caught a glimpse of them. Jinwoo acknowledged this observation with a quiet thought to himself, wondering if this was yet another effect of his return to this world. Jinwoo had chosen to attend a high school far from his home, preferring the quiet anonymity that came with being a new face. His unfamiliarity with anyone in the class didn't bother him. As others enthusiastically formed groups and chatted, he stayed at his desk, engrossed in a book he had brought along. His peaceful moment was soon interrupted when a classmate approached. The boy introduced himself as Younggil, someone Jinwoo vaguely remembered from his first year of middle school. Younggil seemed friendly, recalling their brief time in the same class and chatting about his recent move to the area. Before the conversation could continue, a group of 4 students, their intentions clear from their demeanor, pulled Younggil away and approached Jinwoo. Their mocking smiles and taunts were unmistakable. They questioned him loudly, drawing attention to the glove on his left hand, making a joke out of it as they exaggerated their ridicule. The group wasn't subtle in their attempt to establish dominance. One of them demanded Jinwoo remove his glove, insisting on trying it on. When Jinwoo didn't immediately respond, another grew more aggressive, accusing him of ignoring their orders. A third speculated aloud, asking if the glove was hiding something something like a tattoo. From within the shadows, a voice filled with anger and protective fervor rang out. Beru, ever loyal to his king. He was ready to punish the offenders, his words promising swift and brutal retribution. Jinwoo, however, firmly stopped him, refusing to escalate the situation. Jinwoo, aware of the growing tension, removed the glove himself. The sight of the disfigured skin was enough to silence the bullies instantly. Jinwoo stared at his uncovered hand, his thoughts briefly drifting to the wound that remained. It was a scar from the King of Dragons, Antares, an injury even his unmatched healing abilities couldn't fully mend. When the bullies saw the burn, they tried to mask their discomfort with mockery. Their jeers stumbled over nervous laughter, dismissing the scar as something grotesque and unpleasant. As they walked away from the shadows, Beru followed the troublemakers, his keen gaze fixed on their retreating forms. But then, as if some invisible force had decided to intervene, the four bullies tripped in unison. They stumbled awkwardly on their way to the back of the classroom, falling to the ground in an almost comical fashion. Beru, observing from below, glanced at Jinwoo for approval, his actions subtle yet purposeful. Jinwoo didn't react outwardly, but thought to himself that a little humor didn't hurt. After all, it had been funny, so it was fine. Later, as Jinwoo and Youngul stepped out of the classroom together, Youngul marveled at how different Jinwoo seemed compared to the past. He noted Jinwoo's composure in the face of the bullies, a stark contrast to how he had been 3 years ago. Curiosity filled his voice as he asked if Jinwoo had trained extensively over the years to gain such confidence. Jinwoo offered a simple smile and acknowledged that he had indeed trained a lot. The conversation shifted to clubs, and Jinwoo's expression brightened slightly. He mentioned, with a hint of excitement, that there was a specific club he wanted to join. Young Gil, puzzled by Jinwoo's enthusiasm, followed him as they made their way toward the track field. Jinwoo stood before the members of the track and field club, his presence drawing the attention of Choi Tae-woong, a senior and a prominent figure in the club. Choi was taken aback by Jinwoo's request to join, especially since it was rare for a freshman to approach them so boldly. Choi's gaze shifted between the two before focusing on Jinwoo. Questions arose quickly from Choi. Was Jinwoo a talented athlete, or did he have prior experience or training in middle school? Jinwoo's calm responses were straightforward. No, he wasn't a sports prodigy, and no, he hadn't trained. His candidness caught the seniors off guard, their skepticism growing. One of the older members remarked that the club was known for its exclusivity, admitting only those with significant potential. They wondered, why would someone with no background in running try to join? Jinwoo's answer was simple yet firm. He had someone he wanted to defeat in a competition. For a moment, Jinwoo's mind wandered. He thought about Cha Hae-in. Back in her junior high days, she had been an exceptional runner, a natural talent on the track. Though her path eventually led her to become a high-ranked hunter, Jinwoo knew her former skills would place her among the best in regional competitions. He saw this as an opportunity, a chance to meet her naturally, in a setting far removed from battles and guilds. Jinwoo's resolve shone through, but the older students weren't about to let him join their prestigious track and field club so easily. Their skepticism was evident, and Choi, ever the leader, decided to set a challenge. He pointed to one of the team members, a lean, confident runner warming up nearby. Choi announced that Jinwoo would need to beat this second-grade substitute, deemed the worst runner in the club, to prove himself worthy. Jinwoo studied the runner. While the young man's appearance might suggest mediocrity, Jinwoo's keen observation told a different story. His muscular thighs and calves, coupled with an air of confidence, betrayed his supposed lack of skill. Jinwoo recognized the ploy immediately. This was no ordinary runner. The other students looked on with smirks, one of them silently amused by Jinwoo's apparent ignorance. That runner wasn't just any substitute. He had placed third in the previous year's regional competition. To them, it seemed absurd that someone like Jinwoo, with no running experience, would even attempt to compete. Choi raised the stakes, making the challenge more than just a simple race. If Jinwoo lost, he would be tasked with laundry and cleaning duties for the team for an entire month. On the other hand, if Jinwoo won, he would secure his place on the team. The condition seemed to amuse the group, as they were confident in their ringer's ability. Without hesitation, Jinwoo accepted the terms. Mr. Park was on a break in the teacher's lounge, trying to shake off the unease he had felt earlier. One of his colleagues approached him, checking on his well-being. Assuring them he was fine, he decided to clear his head and step toward the window, lighting a cigarette. His gaze drifted toward the track field below, where students were practicing. That's when he noticed Sung Jinwoo running with the track team. His brows furrowed in confusion. Why was that delinquent from earlier now among the athletes? The sight didn't align with the troublemaker image he had of Jinwoo. The track and field coach entered the room just then, and Park quickly asked about what he was seeing. The coach, amused, explained that Jinwoo had shown up wanting to join the team. They couldn't outright reject him after seeing his performance, so they told him they were testing his stamina. The coach chuckled, pointing out that Jinwoo was on his 20th lap. Even the coach coach had grown tired just watching him run. Mr. Park leaned against the window, a mix of disbelief and curiosity creeping into his thoughts. Could he have been wrong about Jinwoo? The boy didn't seem like the troublemaker he had pegged him to be. Resolving to observe Jinwoo with a more open mind, Mr. Park decided to put aside his bias and see the truth for himself. Just then, the daylight outside seemed to dim unnaturally, and the field below shifted into something out of a nightmare. The track was no longer filled with running students, but instead an endless army of shadowy creatures standing in perfect formation. Mr. Park's knees threatened to give out as dread washed over him. His mind reeled, trying to convince itself it was an illusion, yet the sight was too vivid, too real to dismiss. Beru turned its head upward, locking its gaze with Mr. Park. Its mandibles opened wide, releasing an ear-piercing shriek that echoed in Mr. Park's mind. A guttural fear overtook him, and he stumbled backward, collapsing to the floor in terror. Darkness claimed his vision as his mind gave way to unconsciousness. Beru went back on the field silently, having noticed the human's reaction. Igris, observing the situation, nudged the ant and shook his head in disapproval. It was clear Beru had gone too far again. Beru muttered an acknowledgement, realizing that this particular human could indeed see them. Late at night, Detective Woo Jimchul and a rookie officer sat in a small restaurant that specialized in grilled offal. The rookie, clearly hesitant, finally worked up the courage to speak. He brought up an incident that had clearly been weighing on his mind, the day the suspects in a bizarre case surrendered themselves and then disappeared without explanation. Jimchul listened in silence, his focus on his drink rather than the rookie's probing questions. The rookie pressed on, his tone becoming more insistent. He asked if Jimchul had seen something unusual that day. At first, Jimchul tried to deflect, dismissing the line of questioning, but something, perhaps the alcohol or his need to unburden himself, made him share what had been haunting him. He described seeing what he could only call an ant monster. His voice was steady, though his words carried a weight that made the rookie pause. Suddenly, a stranger approached them, trying to piece together the description. He asked if it might have been a hybrid, a creature with the head of an ant and the body of a human. Jimchul, initially taken aback, remained silent, his reaction revealing more than any words could. The next morning, the track field was alive with energy. Choi, ever the passionate leader, pushed the team harder. He shouted their goal out loud, his voice brimming with ambition. "Our goal is #1 in Korea." Some of the team hesitated, reminding him their initial aim had been more modest, to win the local competition. But Choi brushed off their reservations, declaring that with their new ace, Jinwoo, the team could set their sights higher. Their voices grew stronger with each repetition. Young Gil had somehow been swept up in the excitement and found himself running with the track team alongside Jinwoo. However, unlike Jinwoo, who moved with ease, young Gil was struggling. His face grew pale, and his breath came in short, labored gasps as he fought to stay in the middle of the pack. Jinwoo noticed young Gil's struggle and couldn't help but wonder why the boy was putting himself through such difficulty. From the shadows, Bellion observed and commented with a tone of disdain, noting how humans often embraced hardship even when it seemed unnecessary. Jinwoo, however, chose a different response. Gathering a small amount of mana at his fingertips, he sent it toward young Gil. Young Gil's reaction was immediate. A wave of energy coursed through him, restoring his stamina and enhancing his endurance. His pace quickened. To the astonishment of everyone, Young Gil began overtaking the older students who had been running ahead of him. The team couldn't believe their eyes. Tae-wong, ever the passionate captain, found himself spurred on by Young Gil's impressive effort. His voice rang out across the track, urging his teammates to rise to the challenge. Mr. Park, known as the Viper, stood at a distance, his sharp gaze fixed on the track team members who had been training relentlessly since the early morning, his mind a swirl of unease ever since that night, a night he couldn't forget. A few days earlier, stress had driven him to an awful restaurant for a drink. It was there that the strange events began. Amid the smoky atmosphere and clinking glasses, he had blurted out something absurd about ant monsters with human-like bodies. When Jimchul and his rookie partner had turned toward him, Mr. Park had felt a cold wave of sobriety hit him. Embarrassed, he tried to laugh it off, apologizing for speaking nonsense under the influence of alcohol, but Jimchul had stopped him before he could leave. With a sharp look, the detective had asked for more details. Reluctantly, Mr. Park had taken a seat, his flushed face betraying his discomfort. He shared what little he could, though every word felt like digging a deeper hole into his sanity. The encounter lingered in his thoughts, making his usual sharp mind restless. On the track field, Jinwoo was aware of Mr. Park's watchful eyes. The teacher's persistent observation didn't escape his attention, and it stirred a quiet alertness within him. From the shadows, Bellion's voice broke the stillness, suggesting an extreme measure, erasing Mr. Park's memories and sight to neutralize the potential threat. Jinwoo, however, held back. He decided against acting impulsively. Instead, he chose to observe Mr. Park's intentions, preferring to keep a low profile for now. Outside the school, Jimchul wrestled with his instincts as a detective. The memory of that night at the restaurant, coupled with the strange occurrences at the school, had sparked a relentless curiosity in him. The connection between the monsters described by the criminals and the shadowy figures only Mr. Park had seen nagged at him. Yet, he hesitated. How could he approach the student about it without sounding like he had lost his mind? As he lingered near the school's main gate, debating his next steps, something caught his sharp eyes. A shadow moved, subtle but deliberate, from the base of a tree toward the wall. It wasn't the trick of light, he was certain of it. Jimchul froze, his instincts kicking in. His breath quickened, his mind racing. Something was there, something real. During geography class, Jinwoo absent-mindedly spun a mechanical pencil in one hand while the monotony of the lesson lulled several of his classmates into drowsiness. His mind wandered, though he remained alert. He realized that someone has noticed the shadow sentries. A sudden knock at the classroom door broke the quiet rhythm of the lesson, startling the geography teacher, Detective Jimchul, whose sharp eyes swept the room with a discerning gaze. Jinwoo recognized that despite not having memories of his past life, the man's instincts were just as sharp as ever, traits befitting the former president of the Hunters Association. Meanwhile, the class buzzed with hushed whispers and speculative murmurs. A detective looking for Sung Jinwoo, many assumed he must have gotten himself into trouble. Jinwoo, unbothered by the attention, followed Jimchul into the hallway. The detective led him to the farthest corner, ensuring privacy from prying ears. Jinwoo studied Jimchul for a moment, a faint smile forming. It had been years since he'd seen this man, or perhaps decades, considering the time he had spent lost in the dimensional rift. The sight of a familiar face stirred a sense of warmth, yet he kept his emotions in check. Revealing too much might raise suspicions. Jimchul, however, found himself unsettled. There was something about Jinwoo that didn't align with what he expected. Finally breaking the stalemate, he reached for his notepad, his thoughts swirling with unanswered questions that had haunted him for days. Jimchul hesitated for a moment before handing it to Jinwoo. The rough drawing depicted the monstrous ant-like figure that had been haunting him, a being both grotesque and fascinating. Jinwoo studied the image with a neutral expression, betraying nothing of his thoughts. Unable to contain himself, Jimchul leaned forward, his voice rising as he pressed for answers. His eagerness bubbled to the surface as he asked Jinwoo again if he truly recognized the figure. With a composed air, he simply confirmed what Jimchul desperately wanted to hear. But as he unleashed a torrent of questions, Jinwoo took a measured step back, maintaining an unspoken boundary. Realizing he had overstepped, Jimchul paused, forcing himself to steady his emotions. He took a deep breath and offered a quiet apology. Then came Jinwoo's unexpected response. With a faint smile and an almost playful tone, he remarked that the figure looked like a monster from children's dramas, the kind with exaggerated special effects. The words caught Jimchul off guard. Jimchul felt a wave of defeat wash over him, his shoulders sagging slightly. The conversation hadn't gone as he had hoped, and the answers he sought remained elusive. With a small sigh, he resigned himself to the situation. Jinwoo, observing Jimchul's subdued demeanor, asked if there was anything more he wanted to discuss. Jimchul shook his head, assuring him that everything had already been explained to the teacher and that there would be no further issues for him. As the conversation reached its conclusion, Jinwoo's eyes fell on the sketch Jimchul had drawn. There was a flicker of amusement in his tone as he requested the drawing, suggesting it would serve as a memorable keepsake of their talk. Hidden in the shadows, Beru's voice rang out, filled with indignation and devotion. He implored his king not to lower his gaze to such an unrefined and poorly made depiction. Despite this, Jimchul carefully tore the page from his notepad and handed it to Jinwoo, who accepted it with a polite thanks. Without lingering any further, Jimchul turned and descended the stairs, his mind heavy with unanswered questions and the weight of possibilities left unexplored. As his figure disappeared, a shadow rippled across the floor like liquid, and Igris emerged, his presence calm and composed. Addressing Jinwoo, he inquired why his master had chosen not to reveal the truth to Jimchul. Jinwoo's response was deliberate and thoughtful. He spoke of oblivion as a blessing bestowed by gods upon humanity, a gift that shielded them from truths too burdensome to bear. Even if man had shaped this outcome using divine tools, the result was still the same. Igris acknowledged the sentiment. When recess arrived, the school buzzed with excitement and speculation. Girls who had already shown interest in Jinwoo now found themselves part of the growing crowd around him, eager to know more. They peppered him with questions, their voices filled with fascination. Some asked about the detective, curious about his relationship with Jinwoo. Others focused on Jinwoo himself, marveling at his broad shoulders and athletic frame. His recent run with the track seniors hadn't gone unnoticed, adding to the growing allure surrounding him. As Jinwoo stood surrounded by his curious curious classmates, the lively atmosphere was interrupted by the arrival of 4 disgruntled students. They were the school bullies, clearly annoyed that Jinwoo had become the center of attention. The leader of the group, Nam, smirked as he approached, his mocking tone breaking the chatter. The crowd around Jinwoo quickly dispersed, the boys retreating to their seats and the girls stepping back silently, unwilling to get involved. Junshik reached out and tapped Jinwoo's forehead, his expression oozing arrogance. He made sarcastic remarks about Jinwoo's popularity, taunting him about being visited by the police. His words carried an undercurrent of intimidation as he demanded Jinwoo relax and not act defiant. Before the situation could escalate, a massive arm wrapped firmly around Junshik's neck. Junshik let out a startled cry as 2 imposing seniors, Choi and Gushik, entered the scene. Their towering presence immediately shifted the dynamic. The seniors wasted no time, grabbing each of the bullies and putting them in the headlocks. The bullies' confidence evaporated, their faces turning pale as they realized they were no match for the seniors. Choi's casual yet firm demeanor made it clear he wasn't there to negotiate. Jinwoo addressed the seniors with a calm tone, expressing mild surprise at their intervention. Choi, however, chuckled as he explained their reasoning. They had come to prevent Jinwoo, their track team's ace, from beating the bullies to a pulp. Jinwoo dismissed the comment, but the seniors weren't finished. Choi then mentioned a welcoming party for the track team's newcomers, ensuring Jinwoo and another teammate, Young Gil, were free after class to attend. Jinwoo acknowledged the invitation, his calm demeanor intact despite the chaotic scene unfolding around him. As Jinwoo stepped out of the school gates, the usual hum of after-school chatter surrounded him, but his attention was immediately drawn to a figure waiting nearby. It was Jimchul, standing with a determined expression, his presence an unmistakable sign that their earlier conversation wasn't over. Jimchul called out to Jinwoo, requesting a moment to finish what they had started discussing. Before Jinwoo could respond, Choi, ever the lively senior, interrupted the exchange. Wrapping his arm around young Gil in a playful manner, Choi teased Jinwoo, reminding him of the welcoming party and jokingly declaring that young Gil would be their hostage until Jinwoo showed up. Acknowledging Jimchul, Jinwoo remarked that he wouldn't be able to stay long, hinting that his friend's fate depended on it. Jimchul's voice trembled with emotion, his eyes welling up as he addressed him with the title Hunter Sung Jinwoo. Earlier that day, Jinwoo had asked Jimchul for the sketch he had made. As he held the paper, Beru's voice resonated from the shadows, protesting fervently, dismissing the drawing as a poor depiction unworthy of attention. However, Jinwoo ignored his loyal summons complaints. Then he carefully tore it out of his notebook and handed it to Jinwoo. Their fingers brushed slightly as Jinwoo took the drawing, and a fleeting moment of connection passed between them. It was a small, almost trivial gesture, but history has a way of turning such seemingly minor moments into something monumental. As Jimchul descended the stairs, his thoughts lingered on what had just transpired. He couldn't help but think that handing over the drawing had been a silly thing to do. A faint feeling of regret tugged at him, but it was quickly overtaken by something far more unsettling. Midway down the stairwell, he froze in place. A voice echoed around him, faint but distinct. "Do you trust me, President Wu?" The words sent a chill down his spine. Jimchul looked around, his eyes scanning the empty stairwell. He dismissed it at first, continuing down the stairs, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Yes, I do." The voice was his own. Panic set in as Jimchul heard more fragments of conversation. The name Hunter Sung Jinwoo repeated over and over, anchoring itself in Jimchul's thoughts. His severe headache intensified as pieces of a forgotten conversation began to surface. He recalled an exchange, a question, a plea for trust, and the moment when a hand had gently touched his forehead. At that instant, the world around him had shifted. His vision had plunged into darkness, only to be replaced by an overwhelming flood of images. The past, present, and future intertwined, showing him scenes of gates, hunters, monsters, rulers, and monarchs. Through it all, he saw Jinwoo standing at the center of the chaos as the Shadow Monarch. The memories were impossible to comprehend, transcending logic and reason. Jimchul felt as though he was watching an eternal battle unfold, one that connected the fabric of existence itself. He staggered, trying to make sense of what he had seen, but the enormity of it left him speechless. Amid the storm of emotions, one truth became painfully clear. Jinwoo was no ordinary student. He was a being who existed beyond the constraints of time, carrying the memories of a world that Jimchul could barely fathom. Jinwoo and Jimchul moved to a quiet park near the school, a peaceful spot where the weight of their conversation could be shared without interruption. Jimchul reflected on the timeline of events as he knew them. By historical accounts, Jinwoo had disappeared for 2 years, but something about the magnitude of the battles Jinwoo described suggested a far longer and grueling struggle. When Jinwoo revealed the truth, 27 years spent in the dimensional crack, Jimchul felt as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. The sheer scale of Jinwoo's sacrifice was staggering. Jimchul couldn't help but ask if he had any regrets. Jinwoo's answer was resolute, unwavering in his conviction. He spoke of his decision with pride, affirming that he would always choose the same path, no matter how many times he had to face it. It was a decision born not just of duty, but of his deep connection to humanity. Jimchul observed Jinwoo closely as they spoke. Despite his immense power, Jinwoo carried himself with an air of normalcy. He mentioned that his life now brought him satisfaction, though it came with its own challenges. Immortality and unaging youth meant he was forced to constantly reinvent his identity, a lonely endeavor despite the life he had fought to preserve. As their conversation deepened, Jimchul asked Jinwoo about his future plans. Jinwoo admitted he had none. Sensing an opportunity, Jimchul suggested he consider returning to a more familiar role, joining the police force. He explained how many criminals, haunted by the shadows Jinwoo had left behind, were turning themselves in, unable to cope with the lingering presence of his power. Jinwoo listened thoughtfully but gently declined, pointing out that if he became part of the police, there would be little work left for anyone else to do. Jimchul, however, saw this as the kind of world worth striving for, a place of peace where people no longer lived in fear of crime. Jinwoo replied thoughtfully, promising to consider it. Before leaving, Jimchul spoke with an optimistic tone, expressing his confidence and waiting for Jinwoo's response. With a playful tone, Jinwoo responded, suggesting Jimchul shouldn't hold on to such hopes, lightly teasing about the tough life of police officers and their modest pay. Their exchange was brief but filled with a light-hearted warmth, offering a fleeting moment of levity. As time quietly moved forward, an ordinary day in late April turned into the beginning of something extraordinary. In the United States, the emergency call center received an unusual phone call from a man traveling through the desert. At first, the agent on the line assumed it was a typical call from a lost traveler. The man's calm demeanor and assurance that he was not lost eased her initial concerns. However, his reason for calling quickly shifted the tone of the conversation. The man explained that he wanted to report something unusual he had witnessed. The agent, sensing his uncertainty, pressed for more details, asking if there was an emergency or a danger that required immediate assistance. The man took a deep breath before describing the situation. His voice, tinged with disbelief, conveyed the surreal nature of his observation. He spoke of something breaking, not a structure, not the earth, but the very sky itself. He described cracks forming in the sky, as if the heavens were splintering apart. The agent, trained to handle emergencies, found herself momentarily stunned. A building collapse or a natural disaster might have been plausible, but cracks in the sky, it defied all logic, leaving her questioning whether she had misunderstood him. Yet the man's tone was earnest, and his hesitation revealed the weight of what he was trying to convey. April was a demanding month for students, but for Jinwoo, it was especially hectic. Between midterm exams and track and field competitions, his schedule was packed. Igris, ever diligent and concerned about his king's academic success, once again stepped in to offer advice. His attention to detail was unwavering, as he reviewed Jinwoo's answers meticulously. Jinwoo wasn't sure how much time had passed when an icy chill ran down his spine. The sensation was sharp and unsettling, a warning he couldn't ignore. Recognizing the urgency, Jinwoo quickly contacted the envoy of the rulers and arranged a meeting at a quiet cafe. The envoy, who had not seen the Shadow Monarch for some time, greeted him with formality, but Jinwoo wasted no time on pleasantries. His concern was immediate, and he addressed the matter directly. Jinwoo wanted to know if the strange disturbance he sensed was caused by the rulers. The envoy, appearing genuinely perplexed, denied the involvement of the rulers. He reminded Jinwoo that their methods and movements were distinct from what he was describing. When Jinwoo pressed further, asking about the identity of those responsible, the envoy provided an ominous explanation. He spoke of otherworldly beings, giants known as Titans, who had recently entered their realm. These creatures, wicked in nature, consumed the star-laden rocks that sustained life. They had initially been driven back by the army of the sky, but had since altered their course toward Earth. Jinwoo questioned the motive behind their arrival. The envoy explained that the Titans were drawn to Earth because of its resources, which matched their insatiable needs. Jinwoo understood immediately that these beings were a threat, not allies. The envoy confirmed his suspicions, emphasizing their danger. As Jinwoo processed this information, a troubling realization struck him. Before the cup of reincarnation had been used, none of this had occurred. The envoy acknowledged the change, mentioning that the timeline Jinwoo now experienced was one altered by lost time. He elaborated that these enemies, who should have been targeting other worlds, had instead turned their attention to Earth. Jinwoo recognized his role in these events. The power he possessed, immense and unique, had left traces that seemed to attract these beings. Even the rulers suspected this, and the army of the sky had already departed, sensing the shift in balance. Though Jinwoo calculated that the Titans would need years to reach Earth through the gates that linked their worlds, he knew time was a luxury he couldn't afford. Resolute and unwavering, Jinwoo made his decision. This was a battle he would face himself, no matter the cost. In the vast desert of the western United States, the government had sealed off an entire area, restricting access as they summoned experts from various fields to investigate. The anomaly was unlike anything seen before. Scholars and scientists, despite their decades of experience, could not provide an explanation for the strange phenomenon. Cracks had started appearing in the atmosphere, widening with each passing moment. Military forces surrounded the site. Tanks, combat vehicles, and heavily armed soldiers stood ready, while the commander assured the president that their forces could handle whatever emerged. Yet, as the situation grew more intense, even the commander noted how much larger the cracks had grown since their initial discovery. Then, without warning, a strange force defied all logic. The tanks, vehicles, and even soldiers were lifted into the air, floating weightlessly as if gravity had ceased to exist. Sung Jinwoo had arrived. Understanding that words alone would not convince them of the impending threat, Jinwoo chose to demonstrate a fraction of his power. He made it clear that the weapons they relied on would be useless against the foes coming through the cracks. Once the soldiers and their weapons retreated, Jinwoo turned his attention to the fractures in the sky. He could feel it, a malignant hunger from beyond, an overwhelming desire to consume everything on this land. The sensation was palpable, their presence pressing down on him like an ominous breath. It had been a long time since he felt such anticipation. A faint smile formed on his face as he summoned his twin daggers from the other dimension. The cracks widened, a shrill sound echoing through the air as the sky itself seemed to shatter. With a deafening roar, the sky split apart, and the Titans descended. Their massive bodies, composed entirely of stone, hit the ground with thunderous force. These ancient beings, towering and imposing, scanned their surroundings and found a single figure standing before them, Jinwoo. They dismissed him immediately, laughing at the notion that this lone figure could stand against them. Jinwoo, however, stood unwavering. In an instant, the ground beneath him turned black as 10 million shadow soldiers emerged from the darkness. Their forms stretched far and wide, transforming the desert into a sea of shadows. The sheer sight of the army was enough to silence even the Titans' arrogance. Far away in the White House of the United States, the president sat alone in his office, deep in thought. His mind churned with unease as he contemplated the recent developments. A crack had suddenly appeared in the sky, and from it emerged entities of unknown origin. It was an unprecedented crisis, one that defied explanation. The president questioned the very foundation of their response. Could they truly handle such a catastrophe in silence without informing the public? And more importantly, did they even have the capability to deal with the creatures that had appeared? His anxious thoughts were interrupted when General Chester Harrison entered the room. The president, who had been awaiting any news with growing dread, sprang to his feet upon hearing Harrison's report. The situation, it seemed, had already been resolved, yet the mystery deepened as Harrison mentioned that the full explanation awaited in the meeting room. As the president walked alongside Harrison, his mind raced with questions. Upon entering the room, Harrison directed everyone's attention to a video recorded by drones and robots. All eyes remained glued to the screen as the footage played on, the room falling silent with the weight of what they were witnessing. Jinwoo signaled to Tusk, his loyal commander of mage soldiers, who immediately prepared for the task at hand. As the spell activated, Tusk and the mage soldiers unleashed a torrent of fiery inferno. The flames surged with relentless intensity, consuming everything in their path and illuminating the darkened sky. The battlefield turned into a blazing spectacle of power. On the front lines, the Naga soldiers engaged in fierce one-on-one combat with towering stone figures. Their relentless charges were matched by the terrifying battle cries of Beru and his ant soldiers. With screeches that pierced the air, they tore through the stone giants, severing heads and reducing their opponents to rubble. Amidst the chaos, Jinwoo focused his efforts on the Titans, the true giants of the battlefield. His movements were a blur, faster than the eye could follow, as he darted through the towering foes. Each strike was precise and devastating, limbs and bodies falling apart under his relentless assault. In a dazzling display of mastery, he summoned countless daggers from the dimensional rift, hurling them at at blinding speed toward the Titans. Many of the colossal beings crumbled under the storm of blades, though one of the largest Titans managed to withstand the attack. This formidable opponent stood unyielding, its gaze locking onto Jinwoo with a mixture of challenge and disdain, but Jinwoo remained undeterred. Channeling immense black energy into his right arm, he enlarged it to match the Titan's massive scale. With a single earth-shattering blow, Jinwoo brought his arm down like a hammer, shaking the battlefield with its impact. The Titan, though impressed by Jinwoo's abilities, arrogantly proclaimed the superiority of its race. Yet before the Titan could finish its taunts, Bellion, Jinwoo's most formidable soldier, intervened. With blinding speed, Bellion's centipede-like blade severed the Titan's head cleanly. Kaisel joined the fray, tearing the Titan apart in a seamless joint attack. The Titan's arrogance was silenced in an instant. Bellion turned to Jinwoo, ensuring that his interruption did not interfere with his master's plans. Jinwoo reassured him and gave further instructions, ordering extra vigilance against the remaining Titans. Bowing respectfully, Bellion flew off to carry out the command. After watching the scene of battle, an oppressive quiet filled the room where the president and his advisors gathered. The gravity of what they had witnessed held them captive, their thoughts swirling in stunned disbelief. The president's mind raced as he tried to process the sight of the mysterious man who had single-handedly decimated the Titans. The president couldn't help but compare the scene to something out of a fictional movie, now horrifyingly real. He turned his focus to the task at hand, uncovering the identity of this enigmatic individual. Despite the president's demands, the intelligence agencies had no answers. David Brennan, the director of the American CIA, admitted that conventional methods of investigation were proving futile. The president's frustration was palpable, but Brennan offered an alternative, a method as unconventional as the situation they faced. The suggestion of Madame Norma Sellner, a figure known for revealing hidden truths through extraordinary means, brought a spark of hope to the room. The National Track and Field Student Athlete Competition was buzzing with energy as the qualifying rounds began. Cheers filled the air, and the tension between rival schools was unmistakable. Among the participants, the captains of these teams, Choi and Kisuk-jo, exchanged heated words, their competitive spirits igniting sparks. Kisuk, leading the team from Hwasong Tech High School, mocked Choi's decision to rely heavily on a freshman in the events. He ridiculed Choi's team for being desperate, mentioning the absence of their star athlete, Sangin. Despite Kisuk's taunts, Choi remained calm, confidently patting Jinwoo on the shoulder. He hinted at the potential of the freshman, challenging Kisuk to underestimate Jinwoo at his own peril. Kisuk scoffed, brushing off the confidence with more jabs, dismissing Jinwoo as no threat. Not one to back down, Kisuk introduced his team's secret weapon, a hulking freshman named Jimchul. As Jinwoo looked at Jimchul, recognition flashed in his eyes. The face, the presence, it was unmistakable. A strange and overwhelming impulse surged within Jimchul, an inexplicable urge to submit to Jinwoo. He couldn't understand it. How could someone his age, who appeared so unassuming, evoke such fear within him? He tried to shake the feeling, refusing to accept the possibility that he might be intimidated. Determined to prove himself, Jimchul approached Jinwoo aggressively. His inner turmoil was hidden behind a loud and confident front. As he confronted Jinwoo, the crowd began to cheer, interpreting the scene as the prelude to a fight. Choi and the rest of the team joined in, half-jokingly urging Jinwoo to hold back and ensure no one got seriously hurt. Jinwoo walked with Jimchul to a quieter area, the air heavy with tension. Jimchul, his emotions roiling, suddenly grabbed Jinwoo by the collar. His frustration and confusion boiled over, and his grip tightened, but it didn't faze Jinwoo. The shadows around Jinwoo began to writhe and roar, their presence undeniable. The echo of familiar voices resonated through the space. The shadow soldiers welcomed their long-lost comrade with a booming enthusiasm, their words filled with an eerie joy. Bellion stepped forward, offering to handle Jimchul personally and ensure such behavior would never occur again. But Jinwoo didn't need words or action to assert control. His mere presence, the unfathomable depth in his gaze, was enough to overwhelm Jimchul. The young man froze, a tremor running through him. Something profound stirred within him, beyond his understanding, as tears began to stream down his face uncontrollably. His legs buckled, and he sank to the ground, unable to comprehend the emotions washing over him. Jinwoo, however, however, remained detached, his thoughts focused. He knew that Jimchul was living as a human now, not as one of his shadow soldiers. There was no reason for their paths to cross further. As Jinwoo turned to leave, Jimchul called out, his voice trembling but insistent. His words were a mixture of innocence and bewilderment, as he misinterpreted the overwhelming connection as something akin to love. Jinwoo paused, caught off guard by the unexpected remark. With a deep sigh, he decided to put an end to the misunderstanding. A simple snap of his fingers caused Jimchul's expression to smooth out, his eyes becoming unfocused. Standing before him, Jinwoo planted fabricated memories into his mind. The false narrative was simple yet sufficient. Jimchul now believed he had picked a fight with someone who turned out to be his father's distant acquaintance, making further conflict unnecessary. With his task complete, Jinwoo continued on his way, leaving Jimchul behind. In his heart, he acknowledged the boy's past as one of the protectors of the world, silently encouraging him to take pride in that legacy. Jimchul, regaining his senses, looked around in confusion. The intensity of the encounter left him disoriented. A sleek black sedan slowed to a stop in front of a quaint house nestled in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. Director David Brannon of the CIA stepped out and made his way toward the home. Norma Selner, the elderly yet enigmatic woman known for her mysterious insights, greeted them at the door with a warm smile. David noted the faint aroma of food wafting from the house. Norma informed them that another guest had arrived earlier, but David didn't let the casual remark deter him from his purpose. He quickly assured her he wouldn't impose for long, intending to get straight to the point. Yet before he could even begin, Norma surprised him with her preemptive words, that after a certain individual sought her out, her ability to foresee events had vanished. David, attempting to maintain composure, chuckled nervously as he recalled her reference to the god of death. Yet her demeanor remained unwavering. She spoke with clarity, explaining that while she could no longer see into the future, the answers he sought had already been seen by her in the past. When David pressed her further, Norma responded firmly. Yes, she knew the identity of the person he was searching for, but no, she would not divulge anything about them. David's frustration began to show as he raised his voice, emphasizing the gravity of what the man in question had done and why the information was crucial. But Norma, unshaken, interrupted him with sharp clarity. Her voice cut through his protest like steel. She pointedly reminded him that his own eyes should have been enough to see the truth. Her reference to a USB and its contents stopped David in his tracks. Her words forced him to confront what he had already seen, but perhaps refused to fully understand. David's thoughts raced as he recalled the overwhelming scene. The strength exhibited by the man in the video was unparalleled. Norma's calm voice broke his reverie, drawing his attention back. She revealed an astonishing truth. This wasn't the first time humanity had been on the brink of destruction without realizing it. David began to wonder if the mysterious man could indeed be what Norma suggested, a force beyond understanding but necessary for survival. As the conversation neared its end, David posed a final weighty question. He turned to Norma, asking if she could guarantee that the man from the video wasn't a danger to humanity. Norma's serene expression didn't waver as she confidently assured him that the man posed no threat. Her certainty was unshakable, and David had no choice but to accept her answer. Resolving to let the matter rest, David nodded and prepared to leave. He decided for now to forget that Norma claimed to know the man. As he stepped out, Norma's warm voice halted him one last time. She offered him some freshly baked cookies, her demeanor now reflecting the gentle hospitality of a grandmother rather than the bearer of heavy truths. David smiled at the unexpected gesture, but politely declined. For the first time since his arrival, the air between them felt lighter. Norma's young grandson appeared, cheerfully offering to escort David to the door. The boy, fond of the director, took his hand and led him out with innocent enthusiasm. Just then, a tall, imposing man with slicked back blonde hair casually remarked about his distaste for the CIA director who had just left. He offered to teach the old man a lesson if Mrs. Selner wanted him to. She, however, met his audacious suggestion with a gentle yet firm reminder of his precarious position as a fighter. One wrong move, and he risked disqualification from the sport that had shaped his life. Undeterred, Thomas shifted his focus. Grabbing a handful of cookies from the bag Norma had prepared, he munched on them with an air of nonchalance. As he ate, he posed a question that had lingered in his mind for years. He reflected on how Mrs. Selner's prophecy had saved him from what could have been fatal accidents, especially in high-risk situations like traffic incidents. Why, he asked, had she chosen to save him back then? Mrs. Selner's gaze turned to the window as she took a moment to gather her thoughts. Her answer, when it came, was both simple and profound. profound. Thomas had done many good things in his previous life. The statement left him momentarily speechless. Could she really be talking about him? The same Thomas Andre who was often referred to as a demon in the UFC arena. The idea seemed almost laughable, yet the sincerity in her voice made him pause. Thomas, his curiosity piqued, decided to delve further. He asked about the man in the video. The enigmatic figure. What could such a man have done to warrant her attention? Mrs. Sellner's response was both awe-inspiring and cryptic. The man had saved the world. Thomas couldn't determine if she was serious or jesting, but the ambiguity was part of what made his interactions with her so enjoyable. Finally, Thomas asked what the hero who had saved the world might be doing now. Mrs. Sellner mused. The hero was out there somewhere, simply enjoying his youth. The atmosphere buzzed with energy as the middle school division's preliminaries were about to begin. The announcer's call prompted runners to gather on the track, their expressions a mix of determination and nervousness. Among them was Cha Hae-in, her focus sharp as the race began. The runners sprinted forward at the sound of the signal, each striving to gain an edge. Midway through the race, Hae-in's stride faltered. Her ankle twisted painfully, but even as she winced and moaned in pain, she didn't stop. With sheer willpower, she pushed through the agony, her determination carrying her across the finish line in first place. After the race, away from the crowd and the prying eyes, Hae-in limped over to the shade of a tree. Exhausted and in pain, she sank to the ground and removed her shoe with trembling hands. Pulling down her sock, she saw her ankle badly swollen, its purple hue betraying the severity of her injury. Frustration filled her as she pondered her predicament. She had passed the first round, but the question lingered. Could she continue running with an injury like this? The thought of giving up weighed heavily on her. Lost in her thoughts, Hae-in didn't notice Jinwoo approaching quietly from the other side of the tree. His voice broke through her inner turmoil, startling her. He spoke with calm authority, pointing out the dangers of running with an injury. Jinwoo warned her of the long-term consequences, sharing the story of someone who had regretted such a decision. Hae-in stared at Jinwoo, her thoughts racing. She didn't recognize him but wondered if he was a track and field participant, perhaps even a high schooler. As she silently observed him, a strange realization struck. There was something comforting about his presence, and a faint but pleasant scent seemed to emanate from him. Jinwoo crouched down beside her, his movements deliberate and gentle. Without waiting for her permission, he touched her swollen ankle. Hae-in flinched slightly but didn't resist. To her astonishment, when he removed his hand, the pain was gone. The swelling had vanished as though it had never been there. She whipped her head to look at him, her shock evident. Jinwoo encouraged her with quiet confidence, telling her to run without regrets because moments like these came only once. As he stood to leave, his words lingering in the air, Hae-in's curiosity overwhelmed her. She called out, asking if they had met before, but Jinwoo didn't answer directly. Instead, he issued a playful challenge. If she could beat his time in the final race, he would give her the answer she sought. Hae-in's competitive spirit flared despite her initial hesitation. She remembered seeing him finish first in every preliminary round and wondered if she could meet his challenge. Yet she accepted, determination flickering in her eyes. As Jinwoo walked away, a small smirk on his face, his thoughts lingered on the girl he had just helped. To him, she hadn't changed at all. Jinwoo turned away from Hae-in and headed to the track. On this sunny spring day, the world record for male high school students in track was shattered, and Jinwoo's team successfully won first place after defeating their rival, Hwasung Tech High School. It was Christmas Eve, and the streets were alive with festive cheer. Jinwoo strolled through the bustling city, making his way toward the meeting place, but his gaze lingered on the stylish couples enjoying their evening. Compared to them, his simple outfit felt uninspired. He grimaced, feeling like someone who had just crawled out from a university exam. Passing by a closed clothing store, Jinwoo's eyes were drawn to a particularly fashionable mannequin displayed in the window. A sudden idea sparked within him. Black smoke enveloped his body, and in an instant, his ordinary clothes transformed into the same stylish outfit the mannequin was wearing. He glanced at his reflection in the store window, seeking approval. His shadow soldiers, ever observant, offered their thoughts. Among them Tusk, who had a keen eye for fashion, eagerly praised the look, assuring Jinwoo that it was perfect. Satisfied, Jinwoo's confidence grew, and he continued toward the meeting place with a renewed spring in his step. The city's festive noise surrounded him, but Jinwoo's sharp senses allowed him to focus. Amid the chaos, he detected the faint sound of approaching footsteps footsteps. Counting down in his mind, Jinwoo turned at precisely the right moment as Cha Hae-in arrived behind him. She had intended to surprise him by covering his eyes, but froze mid-action, caught off guard by his awareness. As they began their conversation, Jinwoo shared something personal, his recent university entrance exam score. Hae-in was visibly surprised, questioning his choice of school when better options were available. Jinwoo explained his reasoning, mentioning a full scholarship, the chance to study abroad, and someone special he wanted to meet there. Hae-in's curiosity quickly turned into suspicion, as she wondered aloud if this someone was a woman. Jinwoo, ever the tease, let the silence linger just long enough to amuse himself before answering ambiguously. Hae-in's reaction was priceless. She pouted, her expression a mix of curiosity and mild annoyance. Hae-in's grin lit up her face as she reminded Jinwoo of an old promise. She spoke with playful confidence, challenging him to a race to a tree just down the street. Jinwoo, amused by her sudden challenge, listened as she explained the stakes. She wanted answers, everything on his mind, including whether the woman he mentioned earlier was someone special, and more importantly, whether they had met somewhere before their track meet. Agreeing to the race, Jinwoo nodded, signaling his readiness to take her seriously. However, before he could react, Hae-in stepped closer, surprising him by wrapping her scarf around his neck. She whispered, "If you like me, don't move." Then, with her eyes fixed on his, she began walking slowly toward the tree. Jinwoo couldn't help but reminisce about the past, realizing he had already lost this bet before it even began. The shadow soldiers, ever observant and excitable, erupted into a chorus of reactions. Some cheered him on, while others expressed disbelief that their king could lose such a simple challenge. Jinwoo shook his head at their antics, glancing around to ensure no one else was nearby to witness the commotion. The quiet street and softly falling snow provided a serene backdrop to their playful competition. Hae-in eventually reached the tree, her victory marked by an excited little hop. Her joy was infectious, and Jinwoo couldn't help but smile as he approached. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation, waiting for him to acknowledge her win. Jinwoo paused in front of her, his gaze steady. With a calm yet commanding tone, he ordered his shadow soldiers to turn away. The playful energy between them shifted to something quieter and more intimate. Their lips met gently, the world around them fading into the stillness of the moment. The falling snow seemed to blanket the street in silence, leaving only the quiet connection between the two of them. In the quiet, boundless expanse of the world of repose, Kaisel greeted Tusk with warmth, and the other shadow soldiers followed with respectful salutations. Tusk acknowledged them with enthusiasm, though he couldn't help but remark on the timeless nature of their realm. Without the passage of day and night, the concept of morning felt abstract. For the shadow soldiers, rest was abundant, a natural state until their king called upon them. As Tusk reflected on the peaceful slumber enjoyed by many in the shadow army, Marshal Beru appeared, as if sensing his thoughts. The moment their eyes met, Beru's laughter erupted, sharp and insect-like, yet filled with camaraderie. Tusk joined in, their laughter growing contagious and echoing through the realm. Beru's mischievous expression hinted at success, and Tusk's anticipation heightened. With a flourish, Beru revealed the item he had been hiding. It was a robe, meticulously crafted to mirror the hooded jacket once worn by their king. Tusk could hardly contain his admiration, marveling at the craftsmanship. He voiced his appreciation to Beru, whose pride shone through. Beru, ever the practical thinker, suggested transforming the orb Tusk carried into a staff, a more fitting and symbolic weapon for his role. Tusk immediately recognized the wisdom in the idea. His commanding voice reached the nearby bearded dwarves, artisans renowned for their skill. Their reaction to the general's visit was a mix of awe and nervousness. Bowing deeply, they listened as Tusk explained his request. The elder dwarf, his face lighting up with excitement, assured Tusk of their readiness. He mentioned a sacred timber bestowed upon them by the king, which had long awaited a purpose. In the vast, unending expanse of the world of repose, Tusk observed the remarkable harmony among its residents. With nearly 10 million soldiers inhabiting this realm, everyone contributed in their own way, creating a unique balance. These soldiers, deeply connected to the mind of their monarch, gradually evolved as the monarch's power grew. What had once been hearts driven by destruction now began to embrace human emotions, compassion, camaraderie, and curiosity. The change was transformative. Soldiers who had been empty vessels of war were now finding joy in simple moments, resting, training, chatting, and even quarreling like humans. Tusk marveled at this unexpected evolution, grateful to his king for showing him a world he could never have imagined. The once cold and unfeeling existence had been replaced with a vibrant, dynamic community. Tusk's loyalty and admiration for his liege deepened, filling his heart with pride. Among the bustling activity, Tusk's day took an exciting turn when he received the staff crafted by the dwarves. The sphere of avarice, now mounted atop the staff, sparkled brilliantly, The craftsmanship was impeccable, and Tusk couldn't contain his excitement as he admired the result. Leaving the dwarves' dwelling satisfied, it was then that he noticed unfamiliar figures, a pair of towering stone giants. They introduced themselves awkwardly, explaining that Grand Marshal Bellion had sent them. Tusk examined the newcomers, finding their massive form somewhat incongruous for mages, but he accepted them into his command. Tradition dictated that all new mage soldiers underwent an initiation of sorts. With a commanding tone, Tusk ordered the rest of the soldiers back to their positions and had the two newcomers kneel. Sitting before them, he regaled the stone giants with the epic tale of the battle between their king and the Dragon King and the gap between dimensions. Just then, a voice interrupted Tusk's account. Irritation surged through him as he turned, prepared to unleash his wrath on whoever had dared to disturb him. Marshal Igris stood before Tusk, his presence as commanding as ever. Tusk, caught off guard, felt a surge of admiration. He fumbled slightly before expressing his loyalty and affection for the Marshal, but Igris, ever composed, acknowledged Tusk's words with his characteristic calm. Then, without hesitation, Igris pointed upward, directing Tusk's attention to the sky. The moment was significant. Tusk quickly sat up, his curiosity piqued, as Igris explained the importance of what was about to unfold. Realization dawned on Tusk. This was no ordinary event. Their king Sung Jinwoo had reached a pivotal moment in his life. With enthusiasm, Tusk sprang to his feet, his gaze fixed on the vast expanse of the world of Repose's sky. The realm's unique magic had transformed the heavens into a massive screen, broadcasting their king's experiences. When Tusk noticed Jinwoo meeting Cha Hae-in, his excitement was contagious. He cheered loudly, and the sound of his voice echoed throughout the Shadow Army. The soldiers, attuned to their king's emotions and deeply connected to him, responded in kind. A unified roar of celebration erupted as they raised their arms in solidarity. For them, their king's joy and triumph were their own. As the atmosphere buzzed with energy, Igris remained composed, his thoughts turning inward. He reflected on the first time he had encountered Jinwoo in a dimension shaped by the power of the monarchs. Back then, Jinwoo had been a human unlike any other, a vessel worthy of becoming the Shadow Monarch. Igris had recognized this immediately. The realization carried with it an unspoken understanding that it was his former liege's final order. Igris remembered the farewell he had anticipated from his original monarch, who had chosen to abandon the ceaseless cycle of war. Despite the seeming insignificance of a human in the grand cosmic scheme, Igris had known that his liege's interest in Jinwoo held profound meaning. Orders from the monarch were absolute, and Igris had neither questioned nor resisted them. Without hesitation, he had pledged his obedience and stood alone in that strange, otherworldly dimension. There, with most of his powers sealed, he had tested Jinwoo, ensuring the human was worthy of the destiny that awaited him. The vast expanse of the recreated dimension stretched before Igris. It was a place painstakingly designed to mirror the moment he had first encountered his liege. Every detail, from the faint echo of footsteps to the subtle chill in the air, was recreated with precision. Igris marveled at the level of refinement, a testament to the architect's skill and the boundless power of the world of Repose. The architect had crafted this space with the monarch's energy, forging a stage worthy of testing the human destined to inherit the throne of shadows. As he considered his role in this pivotal moment, Igris found himself questioning his actions. He had instinctively taken a seat upon the throne, a position he deemed too presumptuous, especially with the presence of his liege's consciousness. With a twinge of unease, Igris moved swiftly, hiding behind a column as a presence approached far sooner than expected. The heavy creak of the door resonated through the chamber, signaling the arrival of the chosen human. Wrapped in the shroud of darkness, Igris observed silently, taking in the man who carried the weight of his liege's expectations. The human's presence was undeniable. He had been marked by the monarch's power, yet there was an aura of mortality about him that Igris found both intriguing and concerning. This test, entrusted to Igris as his final mission, was not one he would approach lightly. The human would have to prove himself worthy of the throne. If he fell short, if he was found lacking in ability or resolve, Igris would show no mercy. The throne was not a place for the weak or unfit. With this resolve firm in his mind, Igris emerged from the shadows, ready to begin the battle. The confrontation commenced with swift movements and sharp clashes. Igris unleashed the full extent of the power he had wielded before his death, his strikes precise and unrelenting. Yet the human's response was underwhelming. Instead of meeting him with equal strength, the man focused on evasion, dodging the deadly arcs of Igris's blade. There was no sign of the talent or ability necessary to surpass the challenge before him. Each movement from the human deepened Igris's disappointment. Despite the human's tenacity, Igris couldn't help but feel that this battle was a mockery of his liege's power. This man, frail and inadequate in comparison to the monarch, could not possibly be the one destined to inherit such greatness. His heart echoed with the verdict. The human was unworthy of the throne. Igris prepared to end it honorably, intending to deliver a swift and merciful death. Yet, as he raised his blade for the final blow, he was struck by an unexpected revelation. The human hadn't surrendered. Against all odds, he continued to fight back, his eyes burning with resolve. It wasn't just the act of blocking the sword. It was the sheer refusal to yield that caught Igris off guard. There, in the man's gaze, Igris saw a faint reflection of his liege. A fleeting resemblance, perhaps, but it was enough to pause his judgment. The difference in power between them was undeniable. By every measure, Igris held the advantage. This was a test, and his stats far exceeded those of the human. Yet he had lost. Was it carelessness? Or was it something more? The human's unrelenting determination had created a miracle, one that neither power nor skill alone could explain. For the first and only time, Igris felt a strange relief at his liege's potential failure. A part of him had selfishly wished for the human to fail, allowing the monarch to remain his liege for a little longer, but the man had proven otherwise. Despite his limitations, he had triumphed, and Igris could only accept the outcome. He had lost, and in losing, he found himself cherished by the new master. As time passed, Igris came to see the human not just as his ruler, but as a comrade and a friend. They fought countless battles together, their bond growing deeper with each conflict. With the addition of the original Shadow Legion, which had awaited the call of its true master, their forces became unmatched. Among them was Bellion, an old comrade of Igris, whose return brought brief joy before the relentless battles resumed. The war against the monarchs demanded everything from them. With each fight, their master grew stronger, his skills honed by the fires of conflict. In turn, the Shadow Army flourished, becoming a force that could stand against the greatest of threats. The battle continued, even after time had been turned back with the Cup of Reincarnation. For 30 long years, the war raged on, annihilating all enemies in its wake. The only opposition left was the fearsome Legion of Destruction. As Igris tore through the draconic army with unmatched precision, one of the ancient dragons, Granode, addressed him. Granode, drained of energy, clutched the sword embedded in his chest, questioned Igris's allegiance, mocking him for serving the new human monarch after once being a proud wing of the Shadow Monarch's army. Granode's words cut through Igris's thoughts, forcing him to confront a truth he had buried deep within. For a moment, Igris stood in silence, looking down at the dying dragon. Granode was right. He had forgotten. The memories of his former master, the Shadow Monarch, had faded away over time. Since when had it been like this? Since when had his loyalty and thoughts become entirely devoted to his new liege? There wasn't much to ponder. Unlike Greed and Iron, who had left behind the burdens of war and chosen to live ordinary lives in this time, Igris remained by his master's side. His loyalty, once tied to his previous monarch, was now firmly rooted in his new king. He was a knight, a sword, one of the wings of the Shadow Army. This was his identity, unshakable and eternal. With the war finally at an end, Igris and the Shadow Army returned safely to their master's world. Life seemed to settle into an unfamiliar peace, but Igris's service to his liege continued. His king, no longer fighting battles with swords, had entered a new kind of struggle, a qualification exam. From the shadows, Igris observed his master's efforts. The young king, expelled from middle school due to frequent absences, now faced the challenge of studying for this new battle. Despite his near-perfect scores on mock tests, occasional moments of distraction led to small errors. It was during these moments that Igris quietly assisted, his unwavering discipline and sharp mind proving invaluable. Who else could support his liege in this endeavor? Certainly not Grand Marshal Bellion, whose massive size was more fitting for battlefields than study halls, nor Commander Beru, whose intelligence was overshadowed by his insect-like tendencies. Only Igris, the knight who had graduated at the top of his academy, could provide such refined and disciplined aid. For Igris, the battlefield of his liege was his own. Wherever his king fought, he would follow. Whether it was the clash of swords or the challenges of a written test, his duty remained the same. With his master stepping into a new kind of battle, Igris knew his own glorified life of loyalty and service would continue for a bit longer. He was the knight of his liege, and his life, bound to his masters, would shine with purpose as long as his king continued to fight. Jinwoo had overlooked something important. Although he hadn't shared his memories directly, there were a few people who had connections to higher beings in their previous lives. Early in the morning, Il-hwan noticed his son emerging from his room with tears streaming down his face. Concerned, he instinctively reached out, placing a comforting hand on Jinwoo's shoulder. The simple touch unleashed a flood of memories from Il-hwan's past life, playing out vividly in his mind. In those fleeting seconds, Il-hwan saw scenes from their previous timeline. He saw himself longing to reunite with Jinwoo and heard words of regret echoing through his soul. The memories conveyed his deep sorrow for the mistakes he had made as a father. As the scenes rewound and restarted, Il-hwan realized this was the work of the Cup of Reincarnation, resetting time itself. Jinwoo wiped away his tears and smiled, brushing off the moment as a bad dream. However, Il-hwan struggled to contain the torrent of emotions within him. He held back his tears, shielding his face behind a newspaper to avoid drawing attention. He felt the burden of knowing the truth while his son remained unaware of his recollections. Later that day, Il-hwan met with one of the ruler's envoys, an emissary who had witnessed Jinwoo's journey. The envoy confirmed Jinwoo's decision to remain in this world. Every moment, every second spent here was precious to Jinwoo. The Shadow Monarch had embraced his life in this timeline, treasuring it above all else. Il-hwan listened intently as the envoy expressed gratitude on behalf of the rulers, acknowledging both Jinwoo's sacrifices and Il-hwan's unwavering role. The envoy offered assistance, sensing the weight Il-hwan carried from his retained memories. Il-hwan, after a moment of reflection, made a heartfelt request. He asked for his memories of the previous timeline to be erased. To him, the knowledge of what had happened before was a heavy burden, especially when Jinwoo, ever perceptive, could sense the truth lingering in his father's heart. Il-hwan wanted to be a normal father, one who could focus solely on his son's present and future. To Il-hwan, Jinwoo wasn't just the Shadow Monarch, he was his precious child. The envoy agreed to fulfill Il-hwan's request. When Il-hwan leaves the cafe, his past memories will reset entirely. The envoy walked away, freeing Il-hwan from the weight of the past and preparing him to embrace his role as a devoted father in the life Jinwoo had chosen to protect. As time passed, the lively atmosphere of a college cafe buzzed with energy. New students were gathered for a welcoming party, chatting and laughing over shared drinks and stories. Among them was Jinho, who sat nervously amidst the crowd. Despite coming from a wealthy family and living a life of luxury, Jinho felt oddly out of place. The unfamiliar environment of a casual restaurant serving frozen pork belly seemed strangely familiar, sparking a sense of deja vu within him. Jinho's senior, a friendly and approachable classmate, tried to ease his tension, offering advice on how to handle the gathering. The senior mentioned the department's most charismatic and intimidating figure, whose mere presence could make juniors uneasy. This description reminded Jinho of his father, a man whose aura commanded both respect and fear. The senior then brought up a well-known name, Cha Haein, a star athlete admired by many, and also the girlfriend of this legendary senior. The thought of such a powerful and respected figure further unsettled Jinho, but he tried his best to fit in with the crowd. Suddenly, Sung Jinwoo entered the cafe and made his way to Jinho's table. Removing his coat, Jinwoo sat down beside him. Jinho couldn't help but feel the weight of Jinwoo's presence, which instantly quieted his restless thoughts. His senior, sensing the shift in energy, quickly excused himself, leaving Jinho alone with Jinwoo. Jinwoo poured Jinho a drink and handed it to him. Nervously, Jinho accepted the glass, preparing himself for the challenge of holding his liquor. However, upon taking a sip, he realized it wasn't alcohol, but something much lighter, just cider. Jinwoo's actions, though simple, carried a certain care that put Jinho at ease. Jinwoo explained that he wouldn't force anyone to drink beyond their capacity. Jinho found himself calling Jinwoo Sung-woo without hesitation, a name that felt oddly natural on his lips despite the unfamiliarity of their interaction. As they raised their glasses for a toast, Jinho couldn't help but feel warmth and camaraderie, as if Jinwoo's presence had filled a void he didn't know existed. Jinwoo walked down the bustling street with purpose, heading toward his next destination. His phone rang, breaking the rhythm of his strides. It was a call from a friend, curious about his absence from the department room that day. Jinwoo explained that something important had come up and casually asked his friend to sign his attendance for the afternoon lessons. His friend's surprise was evident, questioning Jinwoo's location. Jinwoo vaguely mentioned the university hospital's job training and ended the call, leaving no room for further inquiries. As he continued his walk, a young girl passed by, her thoughts spilling into soft murmurs. She was adjusting to life in Seoul after passing her university entrance test and struggled with her Busan dialect and the overwhelming English terms in her nursing major. Her mind swirled with self-conscious thoughts about fitting in, but as she noticed Jinwoo, something about him caught her attention. Unable to stop herself, she called out to him. When Jinwoo turned to face her, she hesitated, unsure of her actions. There was a faint familiarity in his presence, but when she asked if they had met before, Jinwoo responded with a simple yet distant expression that indicated otherwise. Embarrassed, the girl turned away quickly, chiding herself for impulsively talking to a stranger. She worried about what he might think of her, whether she seemed like someone trying to recruit him into a strange group, or perhaps someone with ulterior motives. Jinwoo, amused by her flustered retreat, smiled faintly and continued on his way. His destination came into view, a hospital, serene yet bustling with its own unique energy. The building stood tall and quiet, yet inside it buzzed with activity. Somewhere within its walls, an important figure lay confined to his bed, Chairman Go Gun-hee. In his room, doctors carefully tended to him, their expressions a mix of concern and professionalism. On the small table beside his bed rested a mysterious bottle, its contents shimmering faintly in the light. The chairman's voice was steady but weary as he requested assistance to sit up. The doctors hesitated, unsure about the item on the table and the strange circumstances of its appearance. The chairman explained that a young man had visited him. This stranger claimed to know him from a forgotten time, a time when they had fought together against monsters. As a gesture of gratitude, the man had left behind the small bottle, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared, like a fleeting mirage. The bottle was said to hold something extraordinary, a cure, a cleansing agent that could restore his ailing body. The doctors listened in disbelief, but the chairman, undeterred by doubt, focused on the stark reality of his condition. He reflected on his limited time and the decision before him. If the words of the mysterious man proved false, the worst outcome would be his passing, an inevitability he had already come to terms with. With a steady hand, Go Gun-hee lifted the bottle, its cool surface resting against his palm. He made his choice with the resolve of someone who had spent his life fighting against impossible odds. After uncapping the bottle, he drank its contents in a single motion, his heart filled with hope and acceptance. He leaned back, instructing the doctors to let him rest, as though bracing himself for whatever would come next. Time passed in silence. Then slowly, Go Gun-hee stirred, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. A brilliant light, almost otherworldly, filled his vision, as though a part of another realm had reached out to touch him. As the light faded, the chairman turned his gaze to the window, where the gentle rays of the sun poured into the room. A faint smile graced his face as he murmured to himself, marveling at the warmth of the sunlight. It felt out of place for the approaching winter, yet comforting, as if signaling a new chapter in his life. For the first time in a long while, hope filled the air. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.